The letter arrived before dawn, when the house was still and the candles had burned to their collars, and Maren Ashwick read it twice, because once was not enough to believe it. It was not long. A single page, formal as a notice of death, which in some ways it was. The Duke of Crest Hollow regretted that the terms of the settlement required her immediate removal to Dunore, not the Dunmore of the family seat. The other one. The Dunmore no one mentioned at table, the estate 3 days northeast where the soil had turned to chalk, and the last steward had departed without forwarding his address. She was to take a maid if she wished, though the Duke did not hold himself responsible for the maid's wages after the first quarter. She was to arrive before the 1st of October, as the duchy's solicitors had a legal interest in the property being occupied by then. She had, in short, 16 days. Maren set the letter down. She squared it against the corner of the tray. She noted, with the same detachment she brought to everything, that her hands were perfectly steady. She had known, of course, in the way one knows a thing before one is told it, in the coldness of the corridor when she passed, in the way the Duke's secretary had stopped meeting her eyes, in the way the Duchess of Ashwick, her own aunt, her guardian, the woman who had received the settlement money and placed Maren into the Duke's household like a piece of furniture in need of storage, had begun calling her merely girl at dinner rather than by name. She had been a dependent for long enough to read the temperature of a room before she entered it. She had not expected warmth. She had not quite expected this. She would not yet know what Dunmore would cost her. Had she known, she would have gone all the same, and faster. The maid she brought was called Prue, and Prue was 63 and had outlasted 4 households and held opinions on nearly everything. She packed with the speed and confidence of a woman who had been packed and sent before, and she said, folding a winter cloak, that chalk soil was not the death sentence people made it out to be, provided you knew which amendments to apply. And she happened to know, because her mother had kept a kitchen garden in limestone country, and the cabbages had been a wonder. Maren had not been thinking about cabbages. She was glad someone was. They arrived at Dunmore in driving rain, at the tail end of an afternoon that had never quite gotten light, and Maren stood in the lane and looked at what she had been given. The house was sound. She could see that at once, the bones of it good stone and the roof recently reslated, though someone had done it cheaply and left the southern eave at an angle that would funnel water in spring. The fields were something else. The first she saw was choked with thistle to the hip, and the second had gone to stones. And the third she could not determine the condition of, because a large black dog of no discernible breed was sleeping in the gate and would not be persuaded to move. Prue said he was merely tired and stepped over him with a disregard that Maren found admirable. The dog raised one eyebrow, reconsidered, and followed them inside, where he lay down in front of the hearth as though he had been waiting there all season and was glad someone had finally come to light the fire. There was a caretaker. His name was Aldous. He was roughly the age of the Stones, and he had remained at Dunmore through the last 3 stewards' departures because, as he explained with perfect simplicity, he had nowhere else particular to be, and somebody had to keep the foxes from the poultry, which were also still here, which was more than could be said for the inventory of tools, the grain account, and the second plough, all of which had departed with the last steward and had not been seen since. He told her this without apology and without excessive feeling, the way a man reports a weather system that has already passed. Maren asked him to show her the soil reports. He looked at her with the measured respect of someone recalibrating an assumption, went to a chest in the back room, and produced a sheaf of papers that had not been touched in 2 years. She sat down with them at the kitchen table and read until the candles needed replacing. The fields were not dead. They were hungry. There was a difference, and it was the most important difference in the world, and she knew it because her father had been a land manager before the fever took him, and she had followed him through fields from the time she could walk, learning the language of soil the way other girls learned French, slowly at first, then all at once. Until it was the language she thought in. Her father's land ledger was in the bottom of her trunk, worn soft at the spine, his handwriting in the margins in brown ink. It was the only thing she had taken that was worth taking. She opened it that night to a page he had marked with a strip of ribbon, an entry about chalk conversion and the specific patience it required, and she read it the way she had read things of his since he died, slowly, as though he were still in the room, just behind the candle. She had 16 days before the 1st of October. She had, after the solicitor's fees and her transport, 11 pounds and some shillings. She had Prue, Aldous, 1 dog, an uncertain number of chickens, and 3 fields that had been left to grieve too long. She began the next morning. The Duke of Crestalow, whose full name was Edmund Vere, and who had not wanted to inherit the dukedom any more than he had wanted to inherit the entailment that attached Marin to it, learned that his sent-away dependent had not died quietly of humiliation from his land agent, who mentioned it as a footnote to the autumn accounts. There was a woman at Dunore. She had hired 3 men from the village. She had put in a cover crop on the chalk field that the agent could not identify offhand, but intended to investigate. Edmund looked at the report for a long moment. He was a large, quiet man, the kind of quiet that is not emptiness but weight, and he had a way of folding a document closed that suggested he was also folding closed the conversation it contained. The agent, who had worked for 3 dukes, recognized the gesture and moved on to other business. But Edmund did not move on. He was still thinking about it when the October rains began in earnest, when the accounts for the home estate arrived and showed the 3rd successive disappointing yield from the North Field, when his cousin Serena came to dinner and remarked, over the soup, that she supposed the Ashwick girl was making do, as that sort of person always did. In that way, one says a charitable thing while meaning an unkind one. He said nothing. He had learned early that nothing was almost always the right amount. Serena was beautiful in the way certain winter mornings are beautiful, perfectly composed, entirely cold, and giving nothing away as to what was happening beneath the surface. She had been a fixture of Crest Hollow for 3 years, ever since Edmund's mother had invited her to manage the household on the grounds that a man in grief needed a competent woman nearby. She was competent. Edmund did not doubt that. He had simply learned, in the way he learned most things, by watching closely and waiting, that Serena's competence was the kind that arranged itself around her own interests with the same natural efficiency as water finding its level. She smiled across the table. Her smile was warm in the same technical way that a painted fire is warm. She said that it was generous of Edmund to have sent the girl somewhere with a roof, and that not everyone would have been so considerate, and that Dunore was really very suitable for someone of limited prospects. Edmund said, "Suitable." He said it the way one says a word to hear how it fits. It did not fit. He left for Dunore 11 days later, telling no one but his steward, who told no one because Edmund had asked him not to, and who had been asking no one things on Edmund's behalf for 20 years, and did not intend to begin failing at it now. He arrived in the early afternoon of a day that had decided to be useful, clear-skied and cold, and he came on horseback by the lane that ran along the field boundary so that he saw the fields before he saw the house, and what he saw in the fields stopped him. The thistle field was turned. Not cleared, turned, properly, in long dark furrows that caught the light, the earth a different color than it should have been by chalk country logic, darker, worked, the stone field had been windrow cleared to the edges with a neatness that suggested either more laborers than the agent's report had indicated, or fewer laborers working at considerably greater intelligence. and in the field nearest the house, the one Aldous would later tell him had not grown anything deliberately in 6 years, there were green rows coming up in the low light, small, determined, already planted before the hardest frost, which was either very foolish or very well calculated. He sat his horse in the lane and looked at the rows for longer than he had sat still, and looked at anything in recent memory. He did not see Marin until he had already dismounted, and by then she was 3 feet away and closing, carrying a notebook under one arm and a trowel in her other hand, and she stopped with the precise composure of someone who has learned to absorb surprises without advertising them. She said, "Your Grace." Her voice gave nothing. He said, "Miss Ashwick." "What is in the third field?" She considered him. He had the impression she was conducting the same evaluation of him that he was conducting of her, only faster and more thoroughly, the way an expert in something is always faster than a novice at reading the same evidence. She said, "Winter barley and a clover undersow. The barley is for the spring market. The clover will build nitrogen. I expect to turn it under in May and plant the summer crop on top of what it leaves behind." He looked at the rows. He looked back at her. Her coat was too light for the weather and had been mended at one elbow with thread that nearly matched, and her boots were muddy to the ankle, and she was watching him with an expression of absolute composed neutrality that gave him no more information than she intended to give him, which was, he suspected, less than he wanted. He said, "It is late to be putting barley in." She said, "I know. I have 4 days yet before the window closes, and I intend to use them." He said, "And if the frost comes early?" She said, "Then I will have lost the planting cost and the seed cost and approximately 3 weeks of labor, and we will discuss it. But I do not think the frost will come early, because the hedges are still holding their berries, and the soil temperature this morning was 6 degrees above what the almanac gives for the first killing frost, and I have been measuring it every morning since I arrived, so I have a record if you would like to see it." He would, he thought, very much like to see it. He could not have said why this surprised him. He said, "Show me." That was how it began, with a trowel and a temperature record and a field that had not grown anything deliberately in 6 years, and the particular way 2 people talk to each other when they are pretending to talk about soil. Inside, Prue produced tea with the brisk authority of someone who had decided guests were her department, regardless of what anyone else thought about it, and Aldous brought a chair with the slightly ceremonial air of a man who did not often have occasion to bring chairs and was taking the moment seriously. The black dog arranged himself under the table and went to sleep. Edmund sat across from Marin, with the temperature record between them, which ran for 15 days in her handwriting, which was small and precise and entirely legible, each entry noting the time and the tool used and the location in the field, with a margin annotation on the 3rd day that read wind from east, adjust for sight exposure, and another on the 7th that read 2 degrees lower at the north corner. Investigate drainage. He said, "You expected to need this record." She did not look up from her own copy. She said, "I expect to need most things I gather. It is cheaper than needing them and not having them." He said, "How much has this cost you so far?" A pause, not a flustered one. The pause of a person deciding how much truth to give. She said, £7 4 shillings and some pence. I have the ledger." He said, "I did not ask for the ledger." She said, "You will." "You should. It is your estate." He looked at her. She was still looking at the temperature record, and he had the sense she was giving him a moment to arrange his face before she looked back, which was either courtesy or a very sophisticated form of mercy towards someone who had not, on balance, deserved much of either from her. he said, Miss Ashwick. I did not send you here with sufficient funds. She said, no, you did not. He said, you have managed regardless. She said, finally looking up, I generally do. It is what I was made for, I think, managing things with insufficient resources. It is not a skill I chose, but it is a skill I have. The fire made a sound. The dog shifted. Outside, the clean, cold afternoon was spending itself against the windows, and there was between them a silence of the kind that says something is being understood that has not been said. Not yet. He left before supper, because staying would have required him to know what he was doing there, and he did not quite know yet. He told her he would send funds. She thanked him with the precise gratitude of someone who will not thank twice and does not want to thank once, but understands that a receipt is required. He rode back the way he had come, and at the edge of the lane where the barley field began, he stopped his horse without meaning to and looked at the green rose a second time. He was thinking about a great many things, and none of them were comfortable, and most of them had her handwriting in the margins. The funds arrived in a week. With them came, unexpectedly, a second letter, not from the solicitors, but from the Duke's steward, a man named Pruitt, who wrote to say that his employer had enclosed a set of drainage maps for the north corner of the third field. As the problem she had identified was consistent with a blocked culvert from the previous decade that had never been properly remediated, and the Duke thought she might find them useful, and that the Duke sent his regards. Marin read the letter twice. She put it in the ledger at the page for November. She sat for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Prue said, from the other side of the kitchen, that she supposed sending drainage maps was one way of saying a thing. Marin said that the maps were useful, and that was what they were. Prue said, The winter was hard in the way chalk country winters are hard, which is to say it was relentless rather than violent, the cold coming in low and persistent, finding every gap in the doors and every thin place in the plaster, and sitting there until you plastered them yourself or made peace with the cold. And Marin did not make peace with cold. She plastered. She had Aldous show her the whole of the house's envelope in the first week of November, and noted every place the weather was winning and repaired each one in order of priority. Starting with the dairy, because the dairy had 3 young ewes in it that Aldous had obtained from a neighbor in circumstances he described as mutual benefit, and the ewes needed warmth more than the parlor did. The barley came up. The clover undersow was tentative and low, but it was there. In February, she wrote to Edmund's steward, not to Edmund, to Pruitt, and asked a question about the soil history of the south-facing piece, which none of the reports had addressed directly, and Pruitt replied with the information she needed and added, at the bottom of his letter in a slightly different ink, as though added later, that his employer had been inquiring about the progress of the fields and would welcome any report she cared to make. She wrote a report. It was 3 pages and included a hand-drawn map of the field system with the drainage improvement marked and 2 projected yield figures, one conservative and one optimistic, each with a list of the assumptions it rested on. She sent it to Pruitt. She thought about it for 2 days after and then wrote a 4th page, a personal note to Edmund, which said only that the barley was coming well and the dog had taken to sleeping across the doorstep of the dairy, and she did not know if this was protective behavior or merely laziness, but either way the ewes seemed to find it settling. She did not know why she wrote that last part. She sent it before she could change her mind. He came back in March, when the first warm spell turned the lane to mud and the lambs were new and unsteady in the dairy field. He came without announcing himself again, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through the world, quietly, without warning. In the same way that certain truths arrive, already present by the time you noticed them. She was in the field with Aldous and the two hired men when Edmund rode up, and she did not stop what she was doing, which was standing knee-deep in a drainage trench, pointing at a specific section of the blocked culvert, with the precision of someone who has given this same explanation 3 times and intends it to be understood this time. She finished the explanation, confirmed that Aldous had understood it, and then climbed out of the trench and went to meet the Duke, who was standing at the field's edge looking at the barley. He said, "It is further along than I expected." She said, "I told you it would be." He looked at her. She knew, muddy to the knee again, and her hair had done what her hair did in damp weather, and she was carrying in addition to the trowel a surveying line from the trench measurement, and she was giving him again the composed neutral expression that offered nothing. He said, "You did." She said, "The south-facing piece has some promise if you will authorize the investment in a second season's amendment. I have the numbers." He said, "I will look at the numbers. I would also like to know," he paused, and the pause was unlike his usual ones, this one carrying something that needed to settle before it could be said, "whether you have found it tolerable here." The winter. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I have found it useful." He said, "Useful." He said it the way she had said suitable, in October, turning it over to feel where it pressed. She said, "I had things to do. Having things to do makes most circumstances tolerable. I expect you know that." He looked at her for the long, specific beat of a man making a decision, and then he looked away at the barley field, and he said, "I do know that." Yes, that evening, because Prue had produced a meal of such implacable sufficiency that refusing it would have required both rudeness and foolishness, Edmund stayed to dinner, and Aldous brought the chairs with increased ceremony, and the dog got under the table and slept against Edmund's boot, which Edmund noted and did not remark upon. And over the course of 2 hours, and some good plain food, and a bottle of wine that Edmund had brought because Pruitt had suggested it, he and Marin talked. They talked about the fields. Then about the soil chemistry, which led to her father, which led to his father, who had also kept his own land before duty ate the impulse, and she found that she was reading his face the way she read field reports, watching for where the true information lived, not in what he said, but in the small stillnesses before and after, in the way his hands moved when he talked about land versus the way they moved when he talked about the dukedom, 2 different grips, 2 different weights. He had beautiful hands for a duke. Working hands, the kind that knew what they were holding. She was cataloging this with a discipline that she recognized as unwise and could not quite stop. He said, "There is something I should have done differently in October." She said, "Several things." He was quiet for a moment. Then, extraordinarily, the corner of his mouth moved. It was barely anything. It was nothing if you were not watching for it. It was the first joke his face had made in this room, and she filed it away with the temperature records. He said, "Which would you address first?" She said, "The funds. You knew they were insufficient." He said, "Yes." She said, "You knew before the solicitor sent the letter. It was not quite a question." He looked at her directly, and she held it, and the fire was very quiet. He said, "Yes." She said, "May I ask why?" He said, "There are things I cannot yet lay before you." I mean that precisely, and I ask you to hold it as such. There are parts of this I intend to explain. I am not prepared to explain them now. She looked at him across the table, and she decided, after a moment, that she believed him. She did not know why she believed him. She was not generally in the habit of believing people who gave her partial answers, but there was in his face something that was not evasion. It was protection, held with the same tension as something that has a weight to it, something that cost more than he intended to show. She said, "I will hold it." "For now." He said, "That is more than I deserve." She said, "Yes, it is, but I have become used to managing with insufficient resources." He left the next morning early before the household was properly awake, and she heard his horse in the lane and looked at the ceiling of her room for a long time. Prue said, over breakfast, that he had a good face for a man of his station. Marin said that she had not particularly noticed. Prue said, Spring came in pieces, the way it does in chalk country, grudging, then sudden. One morning everything tight and bare, and the next morning the hedges shouting. The barley grew with a confidence Marin found personally satisfying, not because she needed to be proven right, precisely, but because she had staked her careful remaining resources on her own judgment of the soil and the season. And there is a pleasure in judgment proven out that has nothing to do with pride and everything to do with having learned a thing so thoroughly it becomes reliable. She had a letter from Serena in April. She had not expected a letter from Serena. It was warmly worded, fluently phrased, the handwriting very good. It inquired after Marin's health, after the estate, expressed that Crest Hollow would be quite glad to offer Marin a position in the household upon her return to the south. There would be such a position available, it understood, as the current arrangement at Dunore was temporary and tied to the October legal date, which it had perhaps neglected to mention would be renewed annually only at the Duke's discretion, which meant that in October, Marin's residence here would require his formal reauthorization, which was, the letter said, with its particular brand of warmth, the kind of uncertainty a capable woman in Marin's position might wish to resolve with an alternative in hand. The position offered was companion to an elderly relation of the family. In Scotland. Marin read the letter 3 times. She put it in the ledger, not at the drainage page. In a different section, at the back, behind the expense records, the way one files a thing that needs to be produced later, and not misplaced. She wrote to Pruitt that same day and asked a question about the terms of the October provision that she phrased with care, as a general inquiry into estate administration, without mentioning the letter. She needed to know whether Serena had described it correctly. She suspected she already knew the answer. Pruitt's reply arrived in 9 days and confirmed what she had suspected. The provision was permanent, not annual, and renewed automatically unless dissolved by mutual consent or legal proceeding. The letter Serena had sent was not a lie, precisely. It had simply been built on the assumption that Marin would not know enough to check. She filed Pruitt's letter behind Serena's and said nothing to anyone. In May, she turned the clover under and planted the summer crop, rye and an oat mix, on the nitrogen the clover had left behind, and the turned earth was dark and giving and smelled of the right kind of abundance. And Aldous watched her work and said that his mother would have said the field was coming to itself, and Marin said she thought that was exactly what was happening. Edmund came in June. This time, he sent a letter 3 days before, which was how she knew something had changed. He arrived in the afternoon and came directly to the south field where she was walking the rows, and she waited for him at the field's edge because she had learned, by now, how he moved, and she knew from the quality of his quiet when he had something to say that he was still deciding how to say it. He said, "The summer crop is ahead of the home estate's equivalent field by approximately 3 weeks." She said, "I know." He said, "How?" She said, "I asked Pruitt." He looked at her. Something in his face was doing the thing it did when she surprised him, which was to stay very still for the beat where another man might show surprise. He said, "You asked my steward to compare yields." She said, I asked him to confirm what I suspected. I did not ask him to hide it from you. If he did not mention it, that was his discretion. He said. He did not mention it. She said, then either he thought it was not his information to carry, or he thought you would find out in your own time. Edmund said, and which do you think? She said, with the careful neutrality of honesty that prefers not to be heard as accusation. I think he thought you needed to see it for yourself. They walked the row's edge together, not quickly, the way people walk when they are using the walking as space to say something harder than walking. The rye moved in a low wind. A lark went up from the far end of the field and did not come down for a long time. He said, I owe you a full accounting. The thing I said I could not yet explain, in March. I am nearly ready to explain it. She said, nearly. He said, there is one thing I must confirm first. It requires, he stopped. She waited. He said, it requires me to come back in a fortnight with documents that I have asked a trustee to locate. When I have those documents, I will explain everything. She looked at him. She said, you are asking me to wait. He said, yes. She said, you told me, in October, with a letter from your solicitor, that I had 16 days to pack my life into what I could carry and remove myself to a property no one had wanted to manage in years. You told me nothing else. You have since told me one thing in parts, and both parts have asked me to wait. He was quiet. She had thought he might deflect. He did not. He said, yes, that is exactly what I have done. I am not proud of it. She said, and yet you are asking again. He said, yes. She looked at the rye for a long moment. She said, a fortnight. He said, less, if I can manage it. She said, if you cannot manage it. He said, very quietly, then I will tell you everything I know, whether the documents are in hand or not. I promise you that. She studied his face, the way she studied soil, looking for where the information lived beneath the surface. His hands, at his sides, were still. The particular stillness of a man who has made a commitment and knows the weight of the word. She said, a fortnight then. I will be here. He left. She stood in the field for a long time after, long enough for the lark to come down and another to go up. Prue came out eventually and stood beside her and said nothing, which from Prue was the highest form of company. 8 days later, Serena arrived at Dunore. She came in a hired chaise without announcement, which meant she had planned the lack of announcement, and she arrived in the early afternoon when the hired men were in the far field, and Aldous was with the ewes, and Marin was alone in the house going over the accounts. She came in while the door was standing open for the air, and Marin heard the wheels too late to be anything but exactly what she was, a woman sitting at a kitchen table with a ledger and an arithmetic problem, and no audience. Serena was, up close, even more composed than Marin had expected. She sat across the table without being asked, and folded her hands and smiled, in a way that managed to convey sympathy and condescension with the same gesture. She said, "You look well, considering." Marin closed the ledger. She said, "Considering what?" Serena said, "The isolation. The difficulty. I imagine it has not been easy managing here without proper support." Marin said, "I have had adequate support." Serena said, leaning forward slightly, "Has Edmund been attentive?" She asked it with a careful warmth, the kind that brackets a knife. She said, "I only ask because I want to be certain he has been responsible to you." "He has been." She paused, under some strain this spring. "There are matters of the estate, documents, some confusion about the property arrangements. I hope he has not given you expectations he is not in a position to honor." Marin looked at her. She said, Very quietly, what kind of expectations? Serena looked at her with the practiced sorrow of someone who has rehearsed the look. She said, "My dear, he will not renew the October provision. I do not know how to say it more plainly than that. There are legal complications, and the trustees have advised against it. And Edmund," she said his name with the ease of someone who has used it for years, "Edmund is not always good at telling people difficult things himself. That is why I came. I thought you deserved to hear it directly." Marin was quiet for a moment. The clock on the shelf above the hearth ticked. The dog lifted his head from the flags and looked at Serena and put his head back down. She said, "That is very kind of you." Serena said, "There is still the position I mentioned. The relation in Scotland is a gentle old woman, very easy, very calm. It would be a good situation for someone in your position." Marin said, "What position is that?" Serena said, "Without prospects." "Without," she gestured, delicately, at the room, at Dunore, at all of it, this, if the provision is not renewed. Marin looked at the table. She looked at the ledger. She said, "May I ask you something?" Serena said, "Of course." Marin said, "How long have you been managing the correspondence between the Duke and his trustees?" A pause. Very small. No one who was not watching for it would have caught it. Serena said, "I assist with the household administration, yes." Marin said, "Yes, I thought so." She said it with perfect equanimity. She said, "Thank you for coming. I will consider what you have said. I am sure you have a long journey back, and I would not keep you." Serena looked at her for a moment with the first expression that was not perfectly arranged, something that might have been calculation and might have been the first thin crack of uncertainty, and then she rose with her full composed grace and said that she hoped Marin would be sensible, and left. Marin sat still after the wheels had gone and listened to the clock. Then she opened the ledger to the back section, where Serena's letter was filed behind Pruitt's confirmation. She read both again. She thought for a long time with the orderly application of thought to evidence that her father had taught her, which was to list what she knew, separately from what she suspected, separately from what she could prove, and to find out what instrument would move the suspected column into the proven column, if such an instrument existed. She thought it might. She wrote 2 letters that evening. One to Pruitt, asking a very specific question about the trustees' correspondence records and whether they were held centrally or by individual trustee. One to a woman in the nearby market town named Agnes Collier, who had been her father's second cousin and who had been, before her marriage, a secretary to a law firm, and who had kept her skills well oiled in the way some women keep skills, because they never quite trusted that the world would stay comfortable. She sealed both letters. She sent them with the morning post. Then she went out to the summer field in the early light and walked the rows and counted them, each green stem standing up in the July morning with the uncomplicated confidence of a thing that is doing exactly what it was meant to do. And she felt, underneath the weight of everything, a specific and quiet and bone-deep steadiness that she recognized as the thing that had kept her upright through. Every household that had been too cold or too indifferent or too small, the knowledge that she knew what she was doing, and that what she was doing was working, and that she had built something here that had not existed before she came. Whatever happened in October, the fields would remain. Edmund arrived on the 9th day, not the 14th, and he did not come from the lane side. He came from the South Road, which Marin had never seen anyone use, and he came in a closed carriage rather than on horseback, and in the carriage with him, as she discovered when she reached the yard, were Pruitt and a man she did not know, older, with the careful, neutral face of someone accustomed to hearing difficult things and receiving them without comment. and behind the carriage, having ridden separately, Agnes Collier, who dismounted with the efficiency of a woman who had arranged a great many things in her life and was not going to be dramatic about this one. Marin stood in the yard and looked at this assembly, and then looked at Edmund, who looked back at her with something in his face that she could not yet name. Something between grave and urgent, with underneath it, visible to anyone patient enough to look for it, the first evidence she had seen that he was frightened. She said, "You are early." He said, "Yes." "I asked Pruitt about the correspondence you had sent, and when he told me what you had asked, I understood what you had found, and I came." She said, "Then you had better come inside." The man she did not know was a trustee named Harrow, the third trustee, the one who had not been in regular contact with Crest Hollow. He was here, Edmund said, sitting at the kitchen table while Prue distributed tea with ceremonial gravity, because Harrow had been the one to receive certain letters that Edmund had not written, communications sent over the past 2 years, bearing his secretary's seal. Adjustments to instructions, amendments to the property settlement, a correspondence, in short, that had redirected certain information and certain decisions through a channel that was not Edmund's hands, without Edmund's knowledge, in Edmund's name. Marin said, "How long have you known?" Edmund said, "I suspected for 4 months. I had enough to be certain for 11 days. She said, "And the October letter, the one that sent me here." He looked at her steadily. He said, "I did not write it." The clock ticked. She said, "Serena." He said, "Yes." Marin reached into the back of the ledger and produced the letter, the one from the solicitor that had arrived before dawn in February, and sent her to Dunore with £11 and a maid. She laid it on the table. She said, "I need you to look at the seal." She watched his face as he looked at it. She had seen him hold things carefully. This was different. This was a man looking at evidence of a thing he had feared was true. Edmund said to Harrow, "Does this match the seal on the letters to you?" Harrow had been quiet through all of this with the professional stillness of a man measuring everything before he commits. He produced from his case a letter, one of the redirected ones, and set it next to Marin's. He held them level. He looked for a long time. He said, "Yes." He said it the way a lock sounds when the right key is inside it. Agnes said, from the end of the table where she had been listening with the alertness of someone who has been looking forward to being useful, the device in the lower left corner. "It is a personal seal, not a duchy seal. The fleur is slightly off axis. I can show you where." She showed them where. Edmund put the document down very carefully and was still for the particular stillness of a man taking a blow, without letting his face report it. Marin said, "There is one more thing." She produced Serena's letter from April and Pruitt's response and set them in order. She said, "Serena came here 3 weeks ago and told me the October provision would not be renewed and that the trustees had advised against it. Pruitt confirmed to me that the provision is permanent and requires no renewal. She knew that. She described the provision as annual because she expected I would not know otherwise." Harrow looked at the letters. He said, "She miscalculated." Marin said, "Without any particular triumph in it, she did not know my father had kept land accounts. They sent for Serena." She arrived at Dunmore the following morning, Pruitt having dispatched a note the previous evening, and she arrived still composed, still impeccable, in her carriage with her usual self-possession, and she came into the room where Edmund and Harrow and Agnes and Pruitt and Marin were all present, and she looked at the table with the array of letters on it, and she was, for precisely 3 seconds, perfectly still. Her hands, Marin noted, went to the clasp of her reticule. It was a small silver clasp. She held it, tight, the way one holds a thing when one needs to hold something. Edmund said, very quietly, "Sit down, Serena." She sat. Her face was still composed. Her hands held the clasp. He said, "We have the letters, the ones to Harrow. We have the seal on the October notice. We have a record of the conversation you had here with Miss Ashwick 3 weeks ago. I am going to ask you a question, and I would ask you to be honest with me, not because I intend to make use of dishonesty against you, but because you are going to tell me the truth anyway, and I would prefer neither of us to waste the time." A pause. He said, "Why the October letter? Why send her here?" Serena looked at the table. Her hands were still on the clasp. Then she did a thing that Marin had not predicted. She told the truth. Not all of it, not immediately, but the seam opened, and once it did, the truth had its own direction. She said, "I have managed everything correctly for 3 years. Every account, every household, every person your mother left in my keeping. I have kept Crest Hollow running while you were in grief and unavailable, and the one thing I asked," she stopped. Edmund waited. She said, more quietly, "You looked at her differently, from the first time you saw her in the accounts. I read the receipts. You never looked at anything in the accounts the way you looked at her reports from Dunore." Marin was very still. Serena said, "I thought if she were gone, if the provision were dissolved and she were somewhere remote." She looked at Marin, and for the first time in the room's proceedings the immaculate composure broke at the edge, not into anything as available as tears, just into something that could be read, from a sufficient distance, as a kind of grief. "I thought you would see that I had been here. That I had always been here." The room held this for a moment. Edmund said, "I know you have been here. I have always known that, Serena." He said it without cruelty. He said, "What you have done cannot be undone by saying that." The letters to Harrow, the October notice, the conversation with Miss Ashwick 3 weeks ago, these are not small things. You understand that?" She said, "Yes." He said, "There is a house in Devonshire. It was my mother's. It is comfortable, and it has a good staff, and it has an adequate income attached to it. I am prepared to make that provision over to you with a formal settlement, on the condition that you leave Crest Hollow and do not seek to reinstate yourself in any administrative capacity in the estate or its affairs. You will not be prosecuted. You will not be disgraced. I will tell the household that you have chosen to retire to Devonshire for your health." Serena looked at him. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because my mother was fond of you, and she was right about most things, and I choose to believe she saw something worth preserving. And because the only people who gain from a scandal are the gossips, and I have no interest in feeding them." He said it simply, without ceremony. It was the unadorned statement of a man who has decided what mercy costs and decided to pay it. Serena looked at the table. She looked at the clasp in her hands. She said, after a long moment, "Yes, I accept." After she had gone, the room was quiet in the specific way rooms are quiet when something large has left them. Harrow began, with orderly efficiency, to sort and secure the documentation. Agnes and Pruitt withdrew to the kitchen with Prue, who was already producing something that smelled like it involved cream, and the 3 of them could be heard through the wall, beginning a conversation with the comfortable velocity of people who have been in the same kind of tension for hours and are relieved to be out of it. Marin stood at the window, looking at the summer field. The rye was moving in a low afternoon wind. There were 2 larks above the far hedgerow doing something complicated and disagreeable to each other, and the sound of them carried clean through the glass. Edmund came to stand beside her. He did not stand close, but close enough that she was aware of where he was, the specific quality of his quiet, which she had spent 9 months learning to read. He said, "I should have told you in March." She said, "You should have told me in October." He said, "Yes." She said, "You thought you were protecting me." He said, after a moment, "Yes, and I was wrong. I decided alone who could be spent and who could not, and I spent you." She looked at the field. She said, "The barley outsold your north field by about a third, according to Pruitt's estimate," he said, and there was something almost careful in the way he said it, as though he was handing something back. "I know. He told me." She said, "I am not telling you that because I want to be thanked." He said, "I know that too." She said, "I am telling you because I want you to know that I would have managed. Whatever happened in October, whatever Serena had arranged, I want to be understood on that point. I was not waiting to be rescued." He said, "I know." She said, "Then why are you still standing here?" A pause. The larks resolved their disagreement. The rye moved. He said, "Because I would like to stay. If you will allow it. Not because the fields need anything, and not because the estate requires it, and not because any arrangement obliges either of us. Because I have been in this room 9 months." He paused. 8 days of those months, actually, in this room, and I find that the number is insufficient. She turned and looked at him. He said, "I will not make this a negotiation. I have used you badly enough in negotiations already. I would like your company. I would like to know what you know about soil, and about chalk, and about the Southfield's drainage problem, and about—" He stopped. He said, more quietly, "Marry me because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take." She looked at his face, which she had been reading for 9 months and had grown, over that time, to trust in the specific way she trusted instruments that had proven themselves accurate under difficult conditions. She looked at his hands, still at his sides. She thought about the letter that had arrived before, dawn in a house that was too cold. She thought about the temperature record, 15 days of early mornings in the chalk field, measuring what was there rather than what anyone expected. She thought about her father's ledger, the margin notes in brown ink, the ribbon on the page about patience. She said, "I will need to think about it." He said, "I expected that." She said, "You have a month." He said, "Less, if you would like." She said, and something in her voice was not quite the composed neutral she had given him for 9 months, something warmer and more honest than that. "No, a month. I will use the time." He said, "Wisely, I imagine." And there it was again, the corner of his mouth, not just moving this time, a full small thing, undeniable, warm, she said. "With great care, I imagine so." They were married in October. The ceremony was small, in the village church, on a bright cold morning that smelled of cut grass and the first hint of the season turning. Aldous came in his good coat, which turned out to be a coat of genuine quality, perhaps 50 years old but kept very well, and Prue wept for the entirety of the vows, and then denied it afterward with a composure that no one believed. Harrow served as witness with the air of a man who has witnessed many things, and found this one among the more satisfactory. Agnes held Marin's flowers, and then her own, as it turned out, because Pruitt had been corresponding with Agnes since May about a matter he described as administrative, and which was nothing of the kind, and the whole village had known before either of them did. The black dog attended without being invited. No one tried to remove him. Serena received the Devonshire house in November. She wrote once a short letter, and it said only that the garden had some promise and that she was finding the air useful, and Marin wrote back a note that said she hoped the spring would be kind to it, and that was the last correspondence between them. Aldous' third field delivered a crop the following spring that Aldous described as satisfactory, which from Aldous was indistinguishable from delirium. The drainage culvert held. The ewes had lambs again, and the lambs were steadier than the previous years, and the dog surveyed them from the dairy gate with a proprietorial air that suggested he had been managing the situation all along. Edmund's North Field, with Marin's amendment recommendations and a new drainage scheme, came in ahead of projection that autumn by a margin that the land agent put in his report, and Edmund put on the wall of the study, framed, with no annotation necessary. Marin's father's land ledger went on the shelf above the hearth in the kitchen at Dunore, spine out, where it had light and could be reached. She had thought about the library. She had put it in the kitchen because the kitchen was where the real decisions were made, and besides, she wanted to be able to look at the handwriting while she was thinking. Prue said the marriage suited Marin, by which she meant it suited her, because the kitchen was better appointed now, and someone had finally addressed the chimney draw. On a morning in September, about a year after the letter that had arrived before dawn, Marin came down early while the house was still, and the fire was only starting, and stood in the door of the dairy field, and looked at the field's edge where the rye had been, and where the winter barley was just beginning to show, thin, determined, bright green against the chalk-pale soil. And she thought of her father's handwriting in the margin chalk conversion and the specific patience it requires, and she thought, yes, that is exactly what it is. The door opened behind her, and Edmund came and stood beside her with 2 cups of something hot, and she took one without looking, and they stood together in the early light of a September morning that smelled of turned earth and turned season, and the single lark that always rose from the far hedgerow at this hour went up again with its ridiculous and magnificent enthusiasm, and kept rising. He said very quietly, "You are counting them again." She said, "The barley rose." "Yes," he said, "and." She said, "And it is coming well." He said, "I never doubted it." She looked at him then. She said, "You sent me here with 11 pounds. He said, "I know. I spent 2 years making that right." She said, "I know you did." And then, because it was a year, and the barley was coming, and the lark was still up, I have decided to consider us settled. He said, "That is more than I deserve." She said, "Yes, you said that before." He said, the corner of his mouth fully committing now, "You are going to keep my accounts of what I deserve very accurately." She said, "That is what I was made for." The lark came down. The field was very bright, the cups were warm, and the morning was spending itself freely over the chalk soil, and below them in the dairy the dog woke up, stretched, and decided against doing anything about it. If this story settled something in you, that patient, quiet faith that the overlooked person who simply kept working would be seen, at last, by the right witness, then you have been exactly where we meant to bring you. Pull your chair a little closer. There is still a cup of something hot, and there are more evenings by this fire. We keep a place for you here at the Hearthside Chronicles, and we would be glad for you to stay, tap the subscribe, and the chair is yours. Before you go, we would love to know, which moment did you feel it turn? When she sent the temperature record? When she filed Serena's letter in the back of the ledger? Or when she told him a month, knowing she had already decided? Leave it in the comments. We read every one. Sleep well and be patient with the things that are quietly coming in. Not everything worth keeping announces itself before dawn.